Hi, so I wanted to talk about having an overactive solar plexus space. This area is where you get a lot of your willpower, your drive. A lot of energy comes from this area of you to get you to do things. And everyone has a solar plexus. Your solar plexus is located at your gut area. So your solar plexus also is responsible for tuning into those gut feelings you get, and it can pick up on fear, as well as the sacral can also pick up on fear. And people usually get the sacral and the solar plexus mixed up, but these are two different minds. So see it this way. Your solar plexus is your drive and your willpower. Think of survival. Anything that ensures your survival, even if it means connecting to a community, your solar plexus will do that. I link this to your ego mind because your ego does this too. Your ego mind is a section of you where you have to either survive by connecting with others, so you will put on you will present yourself a certain way in order to fit into a community, or your ego will go out and get the things that you need to get just to survive or to feel comfortable, pretty much just to ensure your survival. Your solar plexus and your ego, they're the same to me, because in my other videos I explain how each chakra represents each mind, because your chakras radiate out a energy signature, and that energy signature represents a certain mind within your mentality. So when it comes to your sacral is your inner conscious mind. So it's the things that you reflect off of, like when you're consciously doing things, like let's say you're walking through the forest, you're connecting with yourself while you're walking, but you're not doing so with the third eye. Let's say you're with your sacral, you're reflecting off of your experience based on whether you feel comfortable or whether you feel like you're experiencing pain, or maybe you're trying to release self-doubt, or you're trying to release low vibrational emotions that you may be reflecting your experience off of. Like when it comes to your self-esteem, your sacral is responsible for this area of your life, your inner world, not your imagination, but the things that you may fear, and you're able to reflect off of that fear and see why you may be afraid, or not see why you're afraid, but you can at least feel that you're afraid and reflect off of the things that make you afraid. This area is your inner conscious, because the things that go on inside of you, people don't see. And when it comes to the sacral area, the sacral space, this is an area that can be overactive or underactive, and not many people would see that. So at least people wouldn't see it as much as they would the solar plexus. So when it comes to anxiety, when it comes to narcissistic personality types, or just having mild narcissism tendencies, okay? So this represents overactive solar plexus. And of course, if you have an off-balance chakra of any kind, it does throw off all the other chakras. But if you're having an overactive solar plexus, then it's very obvious to you. It's very obvious. And the reason for that is because when you're experiencing anxiety and you are consciously doing something, right? Like let's say you're walking, and then you're reflecting off of your experience of walking through your sacral. You're thinking, I hope I don't get bitten by a bug, or I hope bugs don't bite me. You might be like just holding yourself, feeling a little closed off because you don't really want to be bitten, or you don't want something to happen to you. You may not be paying attention to why you're so closed off while you're walking, but that's why it's your sacral. But then you deciding that either you're afraid and you're going to act on it, or maybe you're trying to hide that you feel a certain way. You do this with your solar plexus. And when you bottle a lot in, or you're not able to express the things that you feel, then it creates an imbalance of some sort, because this is now energy that's being stuck and trapped. It's not being released. And so when you're having an overactive solar plexus, this leads to one of your mental bodies, or just overactive mental bodies, because your solar plexus is linked to your mental body. So now you're starting to overthink your anxiety. Maybe now you feel like, okay, I need to get out of here soon. Maybe I'm going to tell other people that I'm with that, like, either you don't want to be there, or maybe you have to play a mind game with them to get them to leave sooner. Okay, so this can lead to like narcissism, when you are highly when you become highly manipulative to get things done, or to get things your way, because you feel some way in your sacral space, that you have to find a way to get your reality to match what you're feeling inside. Okay, and when it comes to your sacral space, that's an emotional aspect. And so a lot of people who have anxiety or have narcissism, they don't understand their emotions clearly in that moment, in those moments where they're having either anxiety, like having anxiety, or when they're having that trigger to do certain things, to get a certain thing. They're not understanding their emotional space enough. And a lot of the times it's because they have limited access to the heart space. So not saying that we don't have access to the heart space, but the next step to get through this would be to go into your subconscious mind and figure out what's going on in your heart space, right? But what happens is that when you spend a lot of time in your solar plexus or your ego, you don't build your emotional bodies up to be able to handle the space in your emotional body. It's almost like someone has weak emotional bodies, but strengthen that mental body. And when we are having like anxiety, it's because we haven't built up the emotional body enough to be able to handle emotions, or handle emotions as they come. We become more built with our mental bodies, and having a built mental body ensures your survival. Having a built emotional body ensures that you will be able to gravitate towards things that bring you emotional satisfaction, emotional fulfillment. But because we don't see much, a lot of the times, a lot of people don't see much value in building that emotional space, because it could mean that you have to be vulnerable, and that's not a step a lot of people are willing to do, especially if you have narcissistic tendencies, or you're experiencing like even severe narcissistic personality disorder. So that emotional body hasn't been strengthened. It's almost like each time you spend time in any of these spaces, like your any of your chakras, right? These are spaces where you play out. These radiate the energy that play out the energy signature that you're using, which make up the mentality. Okay, and each mind has a form, a light body to represent that energy signature. And each of these energy signatures can be classified as either an emotional aspect or a mental aspect. And if you're not spending enough time working on your emotional state, whether you suppress your emotions or not, that means you either spend time in your emotional states understanding your emotions, or you don't. And then when it comes to a lot of us, we can have overdeveloped mental bodies because we'll spend a lot of time in our ego, and we'll even spend a lot of time trying to organize our whole lives based on how we feel in our ego. So a lot of times people have overdeveloped mental bodies. And so when you're having anxiety, it's because you're reacting off of that emotion, but the way you rationalize this experience from that emotional feeling is by a survival mechanism. Instead of understanding it, you jump into survival, fight and flight. And then when it comes to narcissism, a lot of the times with people who have narcissistic personality disorders, they don't want to spend much time in their emotional bodies. The emotional body makes them highly uncomfortable because it means vulnerability, right? And to understand that would be just highly uncomfortable. So they would rather be in their mental body, which means I'm going to find a slick way to get out of the situation, or I'm going to find a way to get what I want out of this situation, which is more mental than emotional, because to get what you want means that you're not considering, a lot of the times it could mean you're not considering how it affects other people. So since there's no connection, emotional connection there, it's a mental body. You're moving your mental body through a situation. You're maneuvering through your mental body. You're not interconnecting the balance between the emotional and mental body to have a balanced experience. And when you're able to do that, you align those chakras. Well, you don't really align them, but you become more in alignment with what result you're looking for. Because a lot of times when people are maneuvering with their mental body, they don't necessarily get emotional satisfaction. They only get things that are made specifically for their mental bodies, which is very dry connections, very superficial, very it could be very boring and unfulfilling, like unfulfilling emotionally, because you're using that space to get stuff. And when it comes to anxiety, if you're doing fight and flight mode to get out of situations because your sacral is becoming active, then you're gonna start using that solar plexus to get out of there. Okay, so it could be either with your solar plexus being overactive. It's either you're bouncing your experience off of your sacral space, or you're bouncing this experience off of your heart space. A lot of people don't go for the heart space because it means being vulnerable and connecting with yourself more and the environment, being honest, and it can be very unknown. Okay, it could require diving into your subconscious to understand your triggers and to understand the things that make you tick. And a lot of the times that people aren't into diving into their emotional bodies that way, and it's because we've developed weak emotional bodies over time. And then when it comes to how your solar plexus, whatever mind it reflects its experience off of, whether it decides to go right or left. What I mean by right or left, it's either going towards your sacral or your heart. A lot of people go for the sacral. They start experiencing maybe self-doubt, or they just take it as like they don't feel like they fit in, or they feel like they're taking a hit on their self-esteem because their ego chose to reflect its emotional state off of whatever was easiest to access. And if you don't have easy access to your heart space, which again a lot of us struggle with, then it'll bounce off of that sacral. But that sacral, we have to keep in mind that it's at a point where it's at a location of you where fear and self-doubt and all those lower vibrational frequencies, all those things can really affect this area. The same with the ego. Fear can affect the ego or the solar plexus, because the gut area in general picks up on low vibrations like fear. That's why you can get a knot in your stomach when something happens, or you get a gut feeling, right? It can pick up on fear, and same with the sacral, okay? But then when it comes to, if you were to, let's say you were to bounce your ego off of your heart instead, okay? Instead of thinking of your, okay, I'm having self-doubt, you start to gravitate towards your heart. Your heart doesn't necessarily pick up on fear. It picks up mainly on like surprise or shock. You know, that's how your heart space translates that frequency. It doesn't translate it as fear or self-doubt, or you have to criticize yourself. You know, the heart space picks it up as it's supposed to be your center, okay? It's supposed to be where you stabilize yourself, okay? And when you're able to bounce your ego off of that, you can start to understand that the things that go on with your ego aren't necessarily, it's not necessarily what goes on in your heart. You know, those things end up being two different things. You know, how you feel in your heart can feel unknown, because sometimes we don't know how to verbalize how we feel, or sometimes what we feel doesn't make sense. Sometimes what we feel here, we pick up on vibrations in our heart space that don't logically make sense. That's why sometimes we don't even go to the heart, because sometimes it just doesn't logically make sense, and the ego is all about logic. So a lot of people stay in their ego or that solar plexus area. And then when it comes to your heart, because it's so subconscious, because it's so unknown, and because it can pick up vibrations that aren't logical, it would take you having to dive into like your subconscious just to understand why certain things are happening or why you feel certain things. And this would require a lot of vulnerability, and it would be very scary just to like normal people. Normal people don't like jumping into that section of their emotions. A lot of people have weak emotional bodies because they haven't done that inner work to understand their emotional body, or why their emotional states are at a certain frequency. So if you were to work on strengthening your heart space, you were to work on vulnerability and honesty, you would start to feel more balanced and centered within yourself. And you would realize that everything your ego tries to get you to do actually doesn't align with your values, okay? This is when people's worlds start flipping, because now all of a sudden everything that they thought was the answer, all this logic and things that have to make sense, and things have to make sense because that's how the world works, right? That's the ego, or that's the solar plexus. Now with the heart space, just to understand that those things don't align with your values anymore, it would be very subconscious. I call this the subconscious mind, because it is subconscious. We feel things, we pick up on things, and we don't even know why. Like for me, sometimes I'll have instant connections with people, right? And I feel kind of weird because sometimes people make me feel like I'm crazy because I picked up on an instant connection. I mean, not always. When I align with the right people, they're like, oh yeah, I did have an instant connection. But when I've connected with the wrong person before, had an instant connection. I thought I had an instant connection, and I felt something in my heart that logic just didn't make sense. And when I picked up on that vibration, it wasn't fear, you know, it wasn't like, oh, I'm scared because I'm having an instant connection. No, it was just like you connect, and then you just want to align yourself with that either person or with that thing or that situation. And so, long story short, this person was just like, no, you misunderstood. And then they told me to leave him alone. So I was like, oh wow, I've never been so off in my heart. So this area, just being vulnerable in this space, can be very scary. But you know, and a lot of people would stop because it can be so misleading. It can be so misguiding when people are still in that ego and things still have to make sense to them, but you're over here trying to just follow your heart, but then they're telling you you're not making sense. You know, it can feel like you're being misled because, you know, You're just following your intuition, and then someone tells you that, that doesn't make sense. And that's, of course, intuition doesn't make sense. It's not supposed to. It's just another sense that you're equipped with. A lot of people have weak emotional bodies, so they don't have intuition. Okay, they only have gut feelings because they worked on that mental body. That mental body, I guess, can have intuition, except when it comes to your mental body, it can only pick up on like gut feelings. When it comes to, because it makes more sense. But then when it comes to your intuition picks up on like, is what your emotional bodies pick up on. So intuition is connected to your third eye, which is an emotional aspect, and it's also your heart, which is an emotional aspect. Your sacral as well, but your sacral is like a lower emotional aspect. It's like one of your first emotional aspects, just to balance out your ego or solar plexus. So hope all of that made sense. I'm still trying to find a way to make sense of energetics. Making sense of energy, I think we all know that it's there, right? It's just that when you try to break down how this stuff works and make it sound like it makes sense, people are like, I don't know what you're talking about. So I really hope that this was able to open your mind a little bit, just to the fact that, you may be spending a lot of time in your ego space or your solar plexus space, whatever you want to refer to it as. And if you allow access to your heart space more, you won't be using that ego space to reflect off of your sacral space, because reflecting off your sacral space means that you have a higher chance of doubting and having fear, and that's not where we're gravitating towards. We want to gravitate towards using this heart space so we can center ourselves and feel stable and centered within ourselves, okay? And that's the way you do it. So I hope this helps, and you take care.